How's everyone doing? In the spirit of keeping Nostr weird, I'm gonna do this interview barefoot. Um, Edward, I'm not sure if you have shoes on or not, but I hope not. I hope you're comfortable.
I can't see you guys at all, but I'm wearing slippers and no pants, so
There we go.
this will be just fine.
Perfect. Okay, we're starting it weird too. Thank you, um, Edward. So we're gonna have a conversation, and we're going to intersperse with some questions from you all. So I'm gonna call out, and if you have a question, just raise your hand. We have many more people running around with microphones. Edward, I just wanted to start by saying this is the second time I've actually had a conversation with you in front of an audience. The first time was when I was running Twitter, and it's just amazing right now to have what I think will be a similar conversation, but one in a very corporate context, and now in a protocol context, and what that enables and what that will allow. So I feel pretty amazing and honored to always when I'm in your presence, but whenever your image comes up on the screen, I get chills, just because of the sacrifice you made for all of us. And I just want to start this conversation by acknowledging and showing our appreciation for you, and we're so grateful for everything that you've sacrificed to show the world how it was working and how we can be better to each other and what we need to build to get there. So thank you, first of all.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's a very warm welcome to everybody in the room. Thank you. It's funny, actually, now being 10 years on, the world has moved on in a lot of ways. It's nice to be remembered. It's hard sometimes for me personally to remember what it was like 10 years ago and taking that leap to the surprise of everyone. I think myself, first of all, I'm still here and I made it in a lot of ways. Personally, I won. I got away with it. There's a big cost that was imposed. I'm living in exile today, but I think that also puts me in pretty good company. So I try not to let that hurt my feelings too much. Aristotle died in exile. Cicero was in exile. He eventually returned. Ovid died in exile. Spinoza and Giordano Bruno, even Hannah Arendt and Emma Goldman in much more recent times, they were forced into exile. So there's a long history of the thing there. And if you think about what they were doing in every case that sent them there, it was not that they were an enemy of the people, but that their views had made them an enemy of the state. And that actually brings me to my first question for you, Jack, because people who are successful in the modern world, particularly on the corporate level, they get approached, they're interconnected with governments, particularly when it's like a communications platform or a financial platform. You're one of the few people in the modern world who's really sat at like the sweet spot in that Venn diagram of both, from Twitter and from Block. So you've seen both the regulatory pressures from the finance side and the communication side. And I think it's something that we see happening largely on the internet everywhere, where when I was growing up, when you were growing up, when a lot of people in the audience were growing up, not the case for some of the younger members of our audience. They've seen that this is sort of the way it always was. But the internet was amazing. It was something special. It was something that governments didn't really understand. They couldn't really intrude upon. They were just kind of sitting back and watching to see what happened. And then suddenly the internet went from being amazing to not. And Twitter felt the same way. It was amazing, and suddenly it was not. And the world, frankly, in recent years, when we go back to younger days, maybe it's, rose-colored glasses and nostalgia, but I think there's a little bit more to it. Everything was amazing, and then suddenly not. Cory Doctorow has talked about his theory of enshittification, if you can excuse the language, but this is a little less formal, where we got the free ride on the internet of the creative generation and the sharing culture. And now the profiteers have sort of moved in. The pressures and the fiduciary duties have sort of overcome. And now the state is changing. But I think it's not just the network state that's being changed, the state of the services, but the state of the world. And I just, broadly thinking, how do you see what's going on, the journey you've had, your involvement in these things? And just what can you tell us about how the world looks from your perspective?
I think you, well, I had a very similar feeling about the early internet when I first discovered it that I think you've described, and I just recently reread your book, Permanent Record. I didn't reread it, I re-listened to it. Your narrator is excellent, by the way. And it's just amazing to see how curious and driven you are by the feeling of the internet more than anything else, and how it could make people feel, how it made you feel. And I think everyone in this room has had that feeling. It feels open, it feels permissionless, it feels wild and weird and unexpected in almost every way. And in my life, I had never planned to really be a CEO or even start a business, but it happened to be the most effective way to spread the idea. And in this case, it was Twitter. But what I learned when I was in it is that there grows these single points of failure. And the number one single point of failure was myself. In that I was leading and making decisions around this for hundreds of millions of people and policy. The next was what you mentioned, incentives around revenue. Twitter was beautiful in the early days, and Rabel has talked about this, in that it was a pretty wide open API to the degree where we had so many developers on it experimenting, actually a lot of them in Japan. Japan was our biggest market because we had so many developers use the API to make things like Tamagotchis that you could feed and you could see pass away and live and smile. It was amazing. But it actually brought the site down all the time. And we got this fail whale, but that's when it most felt like a protocol, and that's when it felt the most special. As soon as we grew, we started with that feeling, but then we took money from VCs, and we made people that we employed a promise that these shares that we would give them would be worth some meaningful amount more than they were today. And that just set up a whole series of events that took us public, and before that created a business model such as advertising, which became another single point of failure, is the advertising pressure and the revenue model. I've said in the past that if Bitcoin existed before Twitter started, we would have had a much better option and a much better path and removed at least one of the single points of failure. And that's what makes me so excited about Nostr, is it does have micropayments. It's real. It's a scaled experiment that we can actually learn from. And that, to me, is so rare and so amazing that it actually exists right now, and people can play with it and, most importantly, feel it. And then the last single point of failure that was meaningful was what you mentioned in terms of the government, in terms of regulators. Obviously, a lot of this was exposed in the Twitter files, and it's very challenging as an individual or anyone in the company when the government or any government comes knocking at your door. It's very hard to take the stand that you took. especially as you have concerns about revenue and the company just going away because we're the smallest of the giants against Facebook and Google and everything else. And all that to say, what I think is changing, and these are all pendulum swings, and I think the pendulum is swinging back to a world where we can actually persist more open protocols, because we have things like Bitcoin where everyone who contributes to Bitcoin from a development perspective or from a marketing perspective or a policy perspective makes it better for everyone else who does the same thing. And you have this very interesting virtuous loop. And I think the same is true for Nostr. In that, to me, the most powerful idea is not that it's recreating Twitter-like things or handling the social media use case, but it's this open, permissionless ecosystem of apps that anyone who creates one of those, and it's great, actually benefits the entire ecosystem. So it's this like cooperation that continues to build upon itself in a very unique way. And I don't know if we've had the tools to do that before, but maybe we did on the internet, and you know, the downfall was the centralization of the discovery mechanism. That's where Google came in, that's where Facebook came in, that's where Twitter came in.
Yeah.
Away from the Usenets, away from the IRCs, away from Gopher and all these technologies that were truly decentralized but really hard to find something on. So how do you think about discovery?
It's really interesting that you just said that, because I've been thinking in like just the last 2 months. Whenever I use a search engine now, the results are terrible. They're useless. And I don't know if, and I've used multiple search engines. I use it last, but I've even used Google, which is supposed to be the best. I've used Bing, I've used DuckDuckGo, whatever, Startpage, all these other ones. But you're all getting kind of the same thing. And I can no longer find what I need usefully at all. You can't discover specific things from the internet. If I want something general, if I want something generic, sure. But particularly if you're looking for technical content, specialist content, it's really very difficult to get the search engine and narrow down what you want. And like, if I could just run a regex against the internet, I could get exactly what I needed. But this search engines don't let you operate like this anymore. Even, Google, they used to have a ton of search engine operators 10 years ago, like Google hacking was a thing. And now it's all been so closed down, locked down that you can't do any of this stuff anymore. And it's actually interesting. It's kind of similar, I think, to what you were recalling about Twitter's API. Now that Elon's taken over, we lost a lot of basic functions. Like, there was a great command tool called SNS scrape, or I guess SN scrape for social network scraper. And you didn't need credentials, you didn't need anything like that for Twitter. And if you wanted to look at a tag and like how many people were doing this, you could pull tens of thousands of tweets. And time order to do anything like filter down. And it was amazing, the kind of insight that you could get from the network. It was just freely available. The only burden was knowledge. If you understood how to interact with it, you could do it. Twitter search was way better than a lot of other ones. You could put in the little Twitter box things like min underscore retweets colon, and then something to say I only want to see tweets that were effectively popular. And yeah, all that starts disappearing. That level of control disappears, and we see the kinds of content, the kinds of speech that are permissible on these networks beginning to be narrow. We're seeing YouTube go through their big sprint now. They've been doing it for a long time, really ever since they put in that really harsh content ID system. Like, if it even thinks music that's in your video sounds like a copyrighted song, it just completely delists or reassigns sort of earning power to whoever makes a claim, and so then, all these scammers and botters realize they could create like sound-alike songs and then put those out there, or use music that wasn't in copyright, but they could claim copyright for that, and then they could start getting the ad revenue for an entire giant network of people who would just use this free, no copyright music. And it just goes on and on and on. Like there's this level of sort of anti-social activity that exists in any open network, that exists in open life outside. There's always going to be a criminal or non-cooperative element in society. Theoretically, one of the roles of government is to kind of make sure those don't step on the toes of everybody else too hard, right? To try to manage it. The problem starts when they go, oh, well, we can eliminate this. And you get the messianic vision of what government could be, or the institution can be. And you actually see this beginning more strongly to infect major media institutions recently, which is quite difficult, where they go, certain kinds of speech are impermissible, or we don't put here, we don't show here, we don't publish here. The debate is narrowed, as opposed to the old sort of like the meme buff doggy versus Cheems, right? Where you've got the one that's jacked how it used to be, and then the little sad pudgy one that as it exists today. It used to be that we said, the way to deal with bad speech is more speech. You drag the bad argument out into the light, you discredit it, you show why it's unconvincing, and then people no longer adhere to that idea. Well, nowadays we go, well, let's just hide it, let's put it in the dark. Well, bad ideas grow best in the dark, where they aren't challenged, where they aren't confronted. And communities develop out of that, and just a whole universe of problems derive from that. But what I wanted to get back to, which you had sort of gotten into with this API and everything else, is you were talking about how when Twitter was small and it was organic, when it was frankly unreliable and failing a lot, you got a lot of small communities, interested communities, creative communities who were doing things with it that you guys never expected. Like for me, when I tweeted in Japanese a few times, because I lived in Japan many, many years ago, working for the NSA at the time, you can transmit much more information in a tweet in Japanese than pretty much any other language I've ever seen. And that was a surprise to me. But it turns out that Japanese compresses very well to the tweet format. So it's sort of unsurprising that. But the idea that I wanted to say was small communities tend to be better governed. And the larger that we get a sprawl, sort of the worse it becomes. The more competing, the more factionalism, and the more sort of winner-take-all behavior where it becomes, a contest for conquest, I think. And this is what alarms me, is when we see this happening with speech. And, Twitter's under new management now. We've got the sort of Elon era upon us. And, frankly, I think he has been trying to do the best he can. I'm not really impressed with some of the decisions that we've seen, particularly closing off APIs and everything like that. He's going to solve the bot problem, and now any tweet that has any word that's even crypto adjacent in it has like 700 of the same replies underneath it. And it's like, come on, that can't be that hard to fix, particularly when you're charging them $1 to make that tweet or whatever, that account. There is a risk of a false consensus forming. And actually, I don't want to ramble too much because I've been speaking for like 5 minutes straight here. But when we talk about policy, when we talk about government, when we talk about regulators, there's an idea that what the people who are currently in power are thinking in their heads right now, what's popular at the New York Times, what's popular at the Washington Post, that's not popular, that's correct. And that every right-minded person shares that belief. And it's a presumed belief. They haven't done the work of convincing. They haven't done the work of persuading. They simply assume that everybody else naturally should understand why this is right, that it is right, that it should not be challenged. And anyone who deviates from this belief by a certain degree is spreading disinformation. They are misinforming people. They have become, a network threat. They have become a civic or public threat, and they need to be shut out. And that's one of the things that's, really impressed me when, frankly speaking, you're a guy who's, been to the top, made a gazillion dollars from Twitter or whatever. It's very easy for you just to be like, well, it didn't work out, but I got mine, and sort of ride off into the sunset. A lot of people do that in the world. But instead, here you are right back at it again. And the thing that you said publicly that struck me is you said, you thought the basic mistake with Twitter was not making it a protocol. You publicly pressured, or at least invited Elon many times to take Twitter to be protocol based. And here you are with Nostr saying, it needs to be an unowned protocol. And the fact that we have basically independent speech, and we have at least this hook here for independent payments, to me is the real game changer. I mean, that's what basically limits the damage that these government, regulatory, and institutional speeches can do to public health, right? Because they're supposed to be protecting health. And frankly, even the worst of us understand that government can have a positive role, even for the most radical of us, if they're kept within the box, right, of where they need to be. But when government starts climbing out of that box, that's when things get dangerous. And so we need to have a pretty strong box. We need to have pretty strong borders. And the only technical solutions that we have found to legal or policy problems in the computing era have been ones that are hard lines, like encryption, or like the fact that this is a protocol, right? And you can't just go to someone and say, take this down. You can go to a node owner, you can go to a relay owner and ask nicely, but you can't just, say, do this or you go to jail and then poof, it's gone. Because Elon Musk, who's, purportedly the richest or one of the richest men in the world right now, really shouldn't be the type to be getting pushed around. Like the Indian government was like, oh, take this down. These were clearly things that shouldn't have been taken down. And he was like, oh, it's the law, poof, it's gone. So I went on too long there, but I just want to say, like, I really appreciate the role that you are playing in not simply packing up and going away, but trying to iterate, because that's how things get better here, right? Nobody makes this stuff perfect at once. It doesn't work at right. Frankly, Nostr might not work at all. It might not scale. I've mentioned before, like when I use Nostr right now, I have a lot of trouble connecting through Tor. I don't see things. I got to reconnect 10 times. It's whatever. But these are early days and things do get better. But whether it's communications, whether it's payments, I've talked before about this idea of we need a first post-national bank, right? We don't need the Bank of America. We don't need the Bank of Russia. We don't need the Bank of China. We need something that is post-national, not just extra-national, post-national. It's imagining a world where, states are not the top tier of deciding who gets paid and who doesn't get paid. We need that same thing for speech. And I think protocol-based communication is like the internet, everything that we're doing right now. It's TCP/IP, basically. So even if we get it wrong, even if there are dark points, we can come out of that and things can get better as long as we keep trying. And I've had a tough couple of years, frankly, looking at the direction of the internet, looking at the direction of privacy law, looking at this is sort of civil decay and the discourse and decay. And to hear you still optimistic, to hear you still positive, to see everyone in the crowd who's come here, right? You guys wouldn't be here if you weren't already outliers. We don't need everybody in the world to join us in the beginning to build something great. We just need to care and to try. So I guess this is my turn to thank you.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. I think it'd be very, very hard to walk away knowing everything I learned and knowing, again, what you gave us and knowing that we can fix it. Seeing something like Bitcoin and the person or the people behind it and their intention to, again, take everything they learned and try to build something better for for generations to come. And to see something like Nostr and Fiat and everyone working together in a way that is truly permissionless, and everyone has these incredible ideas, taking feedback from folks like you, and I hope more and more regular folks out in the world who are just trying to express themselves and find expression that resonates with them. Or, you know, the discoveries problem is still extremely hard on Nostr and clumsy, and it's definitely keeping people away. But we do have the benefit of a very early adopter crowd right now, where we can test a bunch on ourselves, and we have the great fortune of having someone like you on Nostr. One of my questions to you, and we should queue up some from the audience as well, would be why did you start with Nostr, and why are you sticking around? Because a lot of what you're bringing to the world right now requires or benefits from a large audience, and you probably have the smallest possible audience with Nostr at the moment. So why are you here? Thank you, but
no, yeah. I mean, it's funny if you look at my Twitter account. I hardly ever tweet anymore. I've got, I don't know, 5 to 6 million followers on that account. So it is a big megaphone. One, I mean, I see there's a lot less engagement on Twitter than you would expect. I don't know if that's because I'm, you know, no longer within the grace of the algorithm or what, but the idea that, you know, you get 100 billion or whatever times more amplification is not always strictly true, even if it appears that it should be true, because it's not like, you know, 5 million people are following this account, 5 million people get served this tweet. It should be that way, but it's not, right? So it's not just black or white, but more directly in real terms. People on Twitter have stopped listening. And it's not to me. They've stopped listening to anybody. And this is more of a global problem than a specific Twitter social network problem. But I think social media and Twitter are emblematic of this in this specific. Everybody is shouting and nobody's listening. I see the sort of disruption that was coming with the sale and the transfer, and everything's changing, and it makes you realize that Twitter may not be forever, and Twitter is not as reliable as you know, you want it to be. If you're someone like me and you really sort of depend on this as your megaphone, because, you know, I'm not on Instagram, I'm not on Facebook, I'm not on TikTok, and I never was. Nostr to me seems like more than you know, just another big media property, specifically because the idea that it's the unknown protocol, and that to me is attractive. That's something I want to see succeed. I want to move the sort of authority for what people see in their feed away from the aggregator and toward the user. Now that doesn't need to be an extreme. It's not like a dial that you have to pin one way or the other. The user just has to like manually click block, don't show me this, shouldn't have to, for 10 billion tweets. They should be able to select like content type lists or whatever, or community sourced lists for these are good accounts, these are bad accounts, like let's get started quickly, you follow all these people, or you don't see tweets from all these accounts that are spammy or gambling or whatever you don't like. But these are human decisions, right? These are personal decisions. These are individual decisions. And sometimes they're collective decisions, but they're not corporate decisions. They're not government decisions. They're not regulatory decisions. And when it comes to speech, I think that's really important. The second thing is Nostr is just more pleasant right now. I mean, when you are not a Bitcoiner, there is a lot of content that I think for the average person is dry. And we do have to get beyond that stage to make it more inviting if we want the network to grow. But for somebody who is interested in Bitcoin, to see, just it's an organic, it's a small community, it's just a start. But to see the potential, to see the enthusiasm, and again, just to see the genuine kindness on a basic level, that's nice. I think when you look at the history of the world, small governments tend to be better governments. Small communities tend to be more kind communities. And it's as they depart from this small sort of like-minded community toward the journey to realize the superstate, right? The global power. That a lot of those ideals and a lot of that vision gets shaken loose like dust on the road. And it's because they have to. Sacrifices have to be made in the name of conquest if you're going in that direction. But there is a magic in the early days, the early network, and the idea, the dream. And frankly, I would not have done what I did in 2013 if I wasn't an idealist, if I wasn't an optimist. Most people who could have seen the same thing as me, and to see it in aggregate or in whole would have been a pretty small group of people, but to see it in part, there were a lot of people who knew the wrong things were going on there. And nobody said anything. And people go, why? And some people think, it's self-preservation or cowardice or whatever. And to some degree, that's correct. But I think there's also a more forgiving way of looking at it, which is people didn't think it would make any difference. And realistically, like what difference did I make? It didn't save the world. It didn't slay the dragon. And the consequences were enormous. The most likely outcome is that I'd be, sitting a supermax right now. And I would for the rest of my life. But we do know now. We have brought sort of a common level, a common picture, a common awareness to the table, not just in the United States, but around the world. And that is something. It's somewhere to start building. It's somewhere to move forward from. And I think that's the basic human drive, where you recognize risk. You see the tiger's tail above the grass, but you go, I'm not just going to sit here and hope it doesn't see me. Maybe it'll get somebody else. Maybe I could take a crack at fixing the tiger problem and recognize that maybe you might not be the guy to do it, and the tiger might get you. But that tiger problem is going to get fixed if enough people try, and we try for long enough. So anyway, I threw my rock. But there's one more thing that I want to get to on that. And it's this sense that government is something that's being done to us now, that we don't really have meaningful control over. Like government is a natural disaster. And government actually likes that. Whatever country you're in, right? They want to be left alone to govern, to make decisions, to order, to regulate. And they don't really want a lot of back talk. They don't want agitation. They don't want dissent. They don't want dissidents. There is this idea among the governing classes that if they're just left alone to do their work, things will get better. That there is a comfortable silence, that if you guys would just shut up and let us get to this, we'll fix the problems for you. Don't worry. But that again comes from that false consensus of what the problems are, how they are to be fixed. But the most important point of freedom of speech and the idea of democracy in general is that we get to argue about what the problems are in the first place. And it's very clear to me that there's not agreement in that today, but there is agreement within the institution that government is the answer. And I think that's dangerous. So the more free speech, the more free protocols, the more creative people striving to create alternative ways to interact, the better. because otherwise these problems are going to be solved for us. And I think in ways that are historically harmful. I think they already have been, and I think they'll get worse.
Absolutely. Why don't we take a question from the audience?
First of all, I'd like to say thank you for being you and living the life you lived. You're a big part of the reason why I'm here, and I'm sure that's true for many of us. We've been talking a lot about key management the past couple days, and as someone who's had to rely on public key cryptography, and now with a family, I'm curious if you have thoughts on the challenges, or the things you're waiting for to be built. Where do you think we should be focused when it comes to making public key cryptography work for regular folk?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a hard one. The minute you said, and now have a family, I was like, oh yeah, I guess my keys will die with me because I don't have a succession plan or anything like that, at least for my beautiful custom brute force and pub. But yeah, this is one of the difficulties, excuse me, with Nostr specifically. I'm not saying I have a better idea, like criticizing or throwing stones here. But for the average person, like the disappearance of the username and the replacement with like this long, 32, 64 character string is like, whoa, what is that? How that can be symbolically represented in an abstracted way, I do think will be important to the success of Nostr. I think key management in the raw public-private key model in the way that PGP, GPG have worked for ages is shown to be basically not fit for normal humans. I used it back in the 2013 revelations. We were using PGP for everything as a layer because I knew it worked. The reason I knew it worked is because I worked at the NSA and I looked in the raw traffic in my last position and things that I had been pulling out. I was looking at counter cyber activities coming out of China. And they weren't really big on PGP, but I had seen things come out of emails and streams and whatnot where it was PGP encrypted email, and it was basically returned with like no decrypt provided, whereas you could get plain text provided for certain other things with crypto systems or whatever, like there was an SSL error or something like that. It happens sometimes. But the bottom line was that it worked. History had proven it worked. It was an old protocol. But it was easy to make mistakes. People commonly send their private keys when they're supposed to be sending public keys, basic things like that. You try to explain this to a journalist who has no technical background, whatever. They don't know who you are, so they don't take you very seriously. Glenn Greenwald famously almost missed the story because I literally recorded an entire explainer video just for him on how to use PGP, and he's like, too busy. And this is the kind of thing we have to understand. What is approachable for ordinary people, for the expert class, for the technical class, for the priesthood, right? We can figure this stuff out. Some of these concepts are familiar to us, and that's great. But that does need to be hidden. It does need to be abstracted, and we need to find a way either to pair a username in a way that there isn't a collision there, like you can't have sort of the impersonation problems and everything like that. And I know we're kind of trying to do that on Nostr, and we've got 70 different providers because, again, it's decentralized. You should be able to do that. But it's also like, what is for discoverability? What is the source of truth? Is there a way that kind of like with Bitcoin, we've got a threshold where most decentralized providers agree that, for example, Jack is Jack, and they provide you the right npub, maybe that works. Maybe that's a solution. I don't know. But in general, the bottom line is, like, we know these forms of cryptography work. They are reliable. That's awesome. That's great, because that's something that we can build on. But we also know that they're incomprehensible to the average person. And it's just a question of how do we bridge that gap. And I'd love to be the guy with the answers, but I'm not.
How, Edward, you're on the board of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, and one of the tasks of that foundation is to help build technologies for activists, for whistleblowers and journalists. If you were to stack rank the greatest needs right now, independent of Nostr and Bitcoin, what would that list look like?
I mean, our marquee project that we've been doing forever is Secure Drop. And that's because, so for people who aren't familiar, Secure Drop is a system that allows major newsrooms like the New York Times, the Washington Post, like every major newsroom in the world that handles anonymous tips, to get a system that is pretty strongly hardened, can be connected to anonymously through Tor by any source, and for them to provide tips without revealing their identity. And this was what was missing in 2013 for me, right? I kind of had to craft my own system out of, coconuts and glue to figure out how I could reveal to journalists what was going on without them knowing who I was, somehow convince them of my bona fides, and at the same time not have them intentionally or unintentionally, which was the real fear, reveal my identity to the government before I could basically get all the evidence and get out. Because the problem is none of them were effectively qualified to handle that kind of problem. You can't take an average journalist and put them up against the NSA and expect to win when it comes to something like covert communications over the internet. Secure Drop was a method it is a method, it's a system that would allow people to basically get two laptops where we've got cubes and a stack of programs like layered on them, applications all the way up, to take care of this for them. And we know it works, and we know it's reliable, and it actually has worked. And some of the biggest stories that you guys have read have been through this system. They aren't actually revealed which ones are and aren't, because it's up to the newsroom to disclose that. And a lot of times they don't want to disclose that because they don't want to get in trouble, but it works. So now when we think about it, I think one of the interesting things is that we have good solutions for people to come forward and to inform the media about what's going on. But there's less trust in the media now, institution. Because frankly, a lot of the most important media organizations, I didn't go to the New York Times in 2013, quite famously. And that was because they had killed the executive editor of the New York Times, Bill Keller, had killed a story about warrantless wiretapping by the Bush administration that should have been published 1 month before his reelection. And that would have swung the election. That election was determined by a very small margin. And if we had known this guy was violating the Constitution to spy on Americans and everyone in the world, we would have had a different history. And the consequence of that is with the New York Times. Hopefully they would do better today, but I'm not necessarily convinced that they would. And a lot of people are confronting that. So the question is today, like, what are the needs? What can we do instead? I kind of feel like something that the Freedom of the Press Foundation might be doing to meet the unmet need is looking at open source packages that pre-exist today, like Open Broadcaster, which is what I'm using right now to bring my camera into yours, and basically create like an instruction stack for how people can self-publish and maybe do it anonymously. And credibly is the problem, because there's so much content on the internet, there's so many extravagant claims, but how do you establish bona fides, right? If I'm talking to a journalist, I could be like, hey, I work here, I'm this, I'm whatever, a government official, but I can't tell you my identity because of this or that. But I can tell you about this program and this program and this program and this program. And when you go to government for comment, their hair is going to fall out. And that will establish to some extent that at least I know things that only someone in there should do. But how do you replicate this for the public without sort of professional verifiers? And when we talk about, validators nowadays, it starts getting into the idea of fact checkers, and fact checkers have not covered themselves in glory either. So it's an interesting and difficult kind of problem space. But I think there's two ways to look at it. One is, how do we enable traditional classic journalism, the best forms of that? And that's where Source really has a lot on the line, tells journalists what they need to know to inform the public. We actually have a good solution for that, and it's gotten better over the last couple of years. But now, how do we get sources to come forward and to shoulder those risks when they can't necessarily trust these classical institutions to act in line with like our Platonic ideal of how they should act? And that's really more of a media problem than a technology problem. We can't solve all problems with technology, but maybe we can come up with an independent solution. I mean, the old independent solution for this was WikiLeaks, where you went, look, you don't want to go to the New York Times. You want to go to somebody else who then will go to the New York Times. People forget this. People think WikiLeaks just threw everything on the internet. But actually, they worked with all the biggest newspapers in the world until those newspapers betrayed them organizationally. The problem is we see what happened to Julian Assange as a consequence. And so this is the idea, we're sitting in conversation on the other side of the world, dreaming about the solutions that we can come up with to these problems. But you have to think from the other side, adversarially. There are governments, like in the plural, not the singular, who are hearing this conversation, and they're hearing us create problems as opposed to creating solutions. They see WikiLeaks, they see public knowledge as a problem to be solved. And I think we need to be just keen to the reality that the world is marching toward the China model. I used to brief at the Joint Counterintelligence Training Academy for the Defense Intelligence Agency on what was called Chinese cyber counterintelligence, ridiculous kind of government branding. But the idea here was it was a conference that would be held, a couple times a year, just to teach new analysts everything that we knew about the Chinese government and how it operated. And I was responsible for this one little technology part of it. But I had a theory that I discussed with the other instructors there that what we were seeing, because people were always trying to guess, what China's going to look like in 5 years and 10 years, who's going to be, the next premier and all that. I would argue that there was a center of gravity. People were saying that we were going to become China, or that China was going to become America, basically, that we were going to adopt the other models. And I actually think it's different. I think there is an authoritarian center of gravity that is pulling all manner of governments toward it, right? The Chinese government is very authoritarian, and many governments around the world are very authoritarian. But what's interesting is that we're seeing more liberal governments becoming more authoritarian. COVID was really a bright red warning flag that it doesn't take much. Sense of panic, sense of emergency. We're seeing the same thing with Israel and Hamas right now, where we go, but somebody's crossed a line. There's a 9/11 moment, and the old rules no longer apply. Classic rights will no longer be protected. The world has changed, so we as institutions will change. There's not time logistically for a vote. There's not time for a conversation. This is an emergency, don't you understand? And so we need to use the maximum extent of our capability, of our technology, to confront the threat. And step by step, bit by bit, what you see China and the United States becoming more like. You see Europe and China becoming more like. They still differ. There is distance between them. but the distance is narrow. And that really is what should alarm us, particularly when you start looking at capability, when you look at surveillance, when you look at QR codes, when you look at control of money flows, when you look at control of communications, when you look at real name policies and identities, when you look at the fact that there's an everything app in China, like WeChat, that does payments, it does chat, it does identity, it does social media, it does travel, it does tickets. But the government in China requires you to go into an office and show ID in order to activate your account. And then you hear Elon Musk saying, oh, X is going to be an everything app. He's starting to pay people, but then you have to tie it to your identity in order to get paid. These are things that should really alarm us. Anyway, I know I got way off the topic here of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, but I think the idea here is we need to understand what problems can be technically addressed, who are our opponents in the ideological space here. And if we can't solve the problem directly, can we raise awareness of the problem for people who maybe can? And if we can't, if it's not possible within our jurisdiction, right? If it's not possible under our sets of laws, if it's not possible in your language, in your culture, in your space, under your government, can we create a new jurisdiction? This is the old sort of Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, which so many people dunk on today, John Perry Barlow, that said, oh, you weary giants of flesh and steel, you have no power here, basically, in the new domain of the mind. This is our world, it's our space, we make it as we wish. You are a guest, you are a visitor, you don't make the decisions. And that, frankly, has not been true, primarily because of the incentives, the corporate and monetary structure, because of payment flows, because of regulation, because of know your customer. But it's also, I think, because the infrastructure is owned. We're riding on somebody else's cables. We're crossing other people's data centers and paths. All the mesh networking ideas haven't panned out. They haven't scaled. They've had problems. But just because they haven't worked in the past, does that mean they will never work? And I don't think that's actually true. I like the idea of sort of opt-in networks, fraternity of community. Where your phone is just out there. If you're carrying a phone, it's already a tracking device, right? It's already reporting itself to the network. But if it beacons out, right, in the same way all these, COVID tracking, Bluetooth, whatever's happening, but it's a beacon actually to other people of like mind. And just when you pass, it makes a brief network connection, and you guys are sort of sharing alike, passing identifiers, passing files, whatever. And it's not a conscious decision. You didn't click a button. It's just, somebody out there, you don't know who they are. You don't have to be sharing identity. You could be dark on the network. You could be dark node. But you just got the updates effectively on your Nostr timeline or whatever for that person's little community. Now you realize this community exists. Now you realize just sitting on the bus that you're a little less alone than you thought you were before. And maybe, talking about, I'm not sure if I just lost you guys.
We hear you.
It looks like I lost my...
We hear you, but we don't see the video, but we can hear you clear.
Yeah, I lost my video. I'll restart that in just a second. I think my camera might have overheated. But yeah, what I was going to go back to with the press side, I'll turn this over and step away just for a second. Maybe, Jack, you take a question for the audience while I work on this. Is you could walk past the newsroom and do the same thing. This is like a classic old spy technique of the dead drop, right? Like Cold War era technology. But imagine, we know the internet is too monitored. Imagine, for example, Tor no longer is reliable for protecting communications because we've got a global passive adversary that can sort of unravel the flows. And it's not clear that that's true today. Everybody's like, oh, Tor's broken, Tor doesn't work. Well, I use Tor all the time. And I do depend on it. It's been pretty good to me. That's not to say, it's absolutely the one thing you can bet your life on it, because no system works that way. But assume that it didn't work. Assume that you couldn't have any network communication like that. Well, you could actually have a device that you put outside the newsroom that is like that. Somebody just walks past the office and they've dropped off their tip, their file, and then they walk right on by. And as long as it's not, strictly time-stamped and indexed against the security camera outside, all journalists know is that they got a tip, and they can't reveal that person's identity because they don't know it. But all right, let me step away and try to fix this camera.
100%. Like it does feel we're moving. Like the everything app is going to be our future, and I love what you said about the Chinese and liberal governments around the world becoming a lot more alike, and the gap shrinking. And it feels like the best thing.
Yeah, it's just a gravity.
Yeah, and the best thing that we can do, knowing that there will be these everything apps and probably competing across literal state lines, is to have a third option, which is something like Nostr and something like Bitcoin, where you do have this this potential for all these apps to work together in a very seamless way without the individual using them having to consider how they switch between. That was one of the most powerful things for me in encountering Nostr the first time, is I could literally take my secret key and go to another client and everything just worked. And if you expand that to all these micro apps in the universe of micro apps, then you basically have the everything app, but you have it on an open protocol where everyone can build. And it's a real competitive answer to what China is building and what companies in the US and Western countries are building, and will most likely, given the direction, is going to capture all of us. So we have an option, and it's in this room, fortunately. And I want to thank you all for helping to build it. So we'll take another question.
Hi. I was wondering, besides the inaccessibility through Tor, are there any other scaling problems that you've encountered while using Nostr, or are there any other things you'd like to see Nostr enable?
I think that one's for you, Edward, if you're still there.
Yeah, sorry guys. We're keeping it weird, right? Yeah, I mean, I actually think Nostr is really capable right now. The main thing is to get people using it. I've seen some criticism of the Lightning Network integration with it, because people have criticisms of Lightning. Lightning has worked pretty well for me. I mean, I've been excited. I see the Zapathons and everything like that. And what I like about it is that it's accessible for normal people. The thing that I don't like about it is that you are replacing one set of centralized gateways with another, in that nobody's running their own sort of Lightning node. Everybody is using like an Albi or some other centralized provider, because they don't have their node running. And when they're offline, like Lightning doesn't work. These problems I don't know how to fix, but the core thing is, when we talk about things like video publishing, which is really, really popular for a lot of people's use cases, how are we going to host that? Image hosting is expensive. Video hosting and serving is way more expensive. And the reason so much of the internet has worked in the way that we grew to understand it was because, like Jack said, there was VC money that was quietly burning in warehouse in the background. What Google is doing right now with YouTube is the best example of that, and kind of what makes me worry for the plausibility of competing with them on that, is you look and they are trying to monetize every last inch of it all at the same time. Like they've become very aggressive with ad blocking. They're running more ads. If you don't run an ad blocker, they'll run more and more and more and more and more ads until you subscribe to their service. And it's all happening at the same time. Whereas for the longest time, YouTube was something that was free, and most of the content that's on YouTube is not the kind of thing that you would pay for. And now suddenly they've changed the game, and YouTube has every video on the internet on it, even ones that don't belong to them were just ripped and re-uploaded from somewhere else. But if you're talking something like Nostr, like, how do we get videos up? How do we host them? Like en masse. I know people can embed things they're doing now. And it's actually beautiful. It works wonderfully. I've had a good experience again when I can connect. But if you think about like a lot of people joining, like the Nostr version of the fail whale, we've got all these relays, and all of these relays have notes that are being written to them that are basically links to these other sites. How are we going to deal with bit rot, right? When we've got one repository like that and the repository goes down, or like the first mover becomes, the sacred cow that we can't get rid of, because if they drop, we are losing a central part of the network, and we're losing the history that comes with it. These are tough questions, I think. But when you think about the basic capabilities for Nostr, the thing that gets me excited is just the idea that it's like Twitter. People like Twitter. They enjoy Twitter without all of the corporate gates and everything like that. I think what people need is the discoverability problem, like you said. Like, I don't know if they're community lists or something like that, where for the onboarding, for the UI, they go, what are you interested in? And it explains that it's like all this is doing is this is adding some popular accounts or trending accounts or whatever for this to get you started. You can still change it. You can do whatever. You can take them out. You can intersect this with block lists or ignore lists or whatever lists. So people very quickly can start saying, who are the people on Nostr who are talking about interesting things? They come in, they have an account, they see interesting things happening, and they go, how do I do this? And then they put out their note, everybody sees it, and then they're off to the races. Actually, there is a question there. If they're not having anybody following them, how does that get seen? Do we have sort of the different Nostr apps, whether it's Damus, whether it's Amethyst, whatever, we've got a guy who curates for those different networks. These are brand new accounts, like on the relays, basically flagged. These are the first times these npubs have ever done any activity, and 99% of it's going to be like Chinese spam or something like that. But to look through it and go, oh, look, this is an actual person, or it seems like an actual person. They're saying something interesting or whatever. And it just does like a call out or a showcase that like tries to get this person their first 10 followers or something like that when you enter the app. Like, I think these ways of welcoming community, of growing community, of like easing the onboarding process, that's really important. But the main thing is I'm actually a little worried right now, like we don't want the march, the influx, the crush of a zillion new users to all come right now, because I'm not sure that Nostr is ready for prime time, in that like we don't have that really friendly onboarding. We don't have the key management thing solved. And if you get 1,000, a million people to show up, you want them to have a good experience from the get-go. Otherwise, they might not come back. But if they do come back, then they're going to tell all their friends, there's this thing that's better than what you're already using. And, you can do your TikTok videos, but you don't have to deal with, TikTok using AI or, machine learning or whatever to listen to what you're saying. And if you use the wrong word, like it downranks your video or whatever. Instead, you can just share things for your friends, and you share things with your friends. Your friends are interacting with your friends, and there's no middle. Like, that's powerful. That's interesting. That's different. And we'll have a lot of problems to deal with down the road. But the main thing is make it work, make it easy, make it friendly, make it interesting. And we don't actually have to make it interesting. We just have to call attention to what is interesting. But somebody who doesn't know even what accounts to follow like that, some of that work has to be done for them.
Yeah, it's a good reminder. It's come up in a few conversations that we may not have the number of users that we see the potential of this for, because we're not attracting people who are not attracted by censorship resistance right now and decentralization, and that's actually okay. The deliberate and thus slow path is the one that lasts ultimately, and we can take this time to really get it right for people and to learn and to ensure that we're presenting something that will last and will be resilient against all these adversaries that will come. And the more we try to rush that too soon, the more likely those things will be hidden from us. And unfortunately not, we wouldn't have the time to fix them. We're coming up on time, Edward. I want to ask two final questions. One of the things I appreciate about Nostr the most and early Twitter is just how real it is and how authentic it is. And I think I've seen every single interview with you. I haven't heard a lot about my first question is I just haven't heard a lot about what your life is like, your day, the small details that like bring you joy in your current day. And then the second question related is, what are those details at home? But like the second question, is there anything that we can do as individuals collectively to help bring you home as well?
Thank you. I mean, on that second one, that's the easier question. I'm not sure that there really is until we get more sane, more stable governments. I mean, the Biden administration is effectively the Obama administration. They're all holdovers. They're all people who were previously in there, and they're really hardcore committed ideologues in a way that you wouldn't expect. It was a way that people actually talked about the Trump administration as being, but the Trump administration was really, frankly, a lot of bunglers and incompetence. It's not clear that they had a common ideology. There were a lot of ideologues in there, including completely insane people like John Bolton. But, they didn't share a common unifying vision, actually. It was basically just whoever was willing to show up. And they, tried to be like government for a day. And they failed miserably because of that. The Biden-Obama administration, these guys are long-term government workers doing what the government's going to do, which is why you see like the Gary Genslers out there that are, they're using the agency, they're using the procedural rules where they don't even have to legislate. They're just going, we're going to interfere with the way the world operates. We're going to make law without making law for as long as we can until we're forced. We know you guys can go to the courts because we know what we're doing is illegal. It's unlawful. But it's going to take 10 years. It's going to take 20 years before you can force our hand on that. And for us, that's pretty much good enough. We pushed it back far enough, and that's something like a victory for us. When it comes to coming home, we have to get people who are willing to recognize that what the government did was wrong, which is interesting because the courts have already ruled on that. It shouldn't be too controversial a statement to be made. Even Obama's Attorney General, Eric Holder, said, he believed what I did was a public service. He still thinks I should go to jail, but he's willing to say, it's a public service. And of course, he was personally implicated in these programs by virtue of the fact he was Attorney General at the time. But these guys retire. These people die. These people move on, right? They age, and the conveyor continues. If we get a sane and reasonable government, it's possible we can have conversations about like how does that go on. But I don't think realistically we see that in the near-term future. Much more important, much more urgent, and much more near is the case of Julian Assange. I mean, this guy has been in a bad prison for a long time. Like he's in terrorist level custody for publishing the truth. The unpalatable truth for these governments, but things that are true. And that is really, it's an indictment of our society, not just in the United States, but in the West broadly. Everyone understands that this is wrong, but nobody does anything about it. And in fact, a lot of the major legacy media institutions that have the voice to change this are largely silent. They have, to their credit, said this shouldn't be done, but they're not agitating. They're not continuing on this because they're all worried about the political implications. They're all worried about sort of a return of Donald Trump, theoretically, and so they won't do anything that will call out, frankly, the hypocrisy of the Biden administration. When you got the Secretary of State out there, Tony Blinken, saying, to like Egypt or something like that. It's terrible, freedom of speech, don't imprison journalists for printing the truth. And then like he's standing on the bound body of Julian Assange as a podium when he's giving this statement. And nobody says anything about that. That's a terrible thing. So we need some kind of connection there. And then, I don't talk about my personal life in interviews. That's actually something that I've, just as a privacy advocate, I've always done. But what I will say is that, I've become a parent. And boy, these last 2.5 years have been really, really tough. It's another reason that my tweet frequency has gone down. I had so much free time before, and now I have none. But that's not to say that it's not worthwhile. I'm trying to begin writing again. I'm trying to begin producing again. It's slow. And, my kids are only going to be this age for so long. So it's all right. I don't resent it. I don't regret it. It's wonderful. But the nice moments are every night. My eldest son, I read him to sleep. Right now, I'm reading him Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. He's not a fan. He actually prefers Winnie the Pooh. But I try to switch it up. I read him. I read him Alice in Wonderland. I read him Winnie the Pooh. I read a lot of children's books that I get off like a Project Gutenberg or something like that, just classic literature. But then I also try to read him these crazy things. Civil Disobedience, Henry David Thoreau. I read him the whole of that. He didn't mind that as much because it was short. When I put that out on Nostr, it was because I had been reading it to my son and I was refamiliarized with the quotes. One that if people are looking for reading suggestions, they're a little less sort of familiar or commonplace, but are very interesting. There's one I believe called Discourses on Voluntary Servitude by Etienne de la Boétie, which is like impossible to type, but if you just look for Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, I think it's very much in line with the ethos of Nostr, and you guys should check it out. It's another one of those that's actually quite short, so it's not hard to work through like The Wealth of Nations. But yeah, I mean, if you ask me what brings me joy, it's the fact that I could see my kids growing. They've gone from, just being little potatoes that make sound to being active thinking beings that are reasoning, that do not agree. Oh my goodness, my children are so disobedient. But, I guess it's in the genes. And there's nothing wrong with that. I like it a lot. I gotta learn to be the disciplinarian, the authoritarian, to the extent necessary. But this is something that we all need to confront, actually. And I think for this audience is very important because for those of you who are of a certain age, like Jack and I am, if you understand the internet, if you understand how it fits together, if you understand the protocols, if you understand the technology, if you understand the interfaces, if you understand the GUIs, if you don't know what a program is, but you can just pick it up, you can figure it out. There's a new app. You don't need the instruction manual, right? You are not the average. We need to remember that there are kids growing up every day that are having their first experiences with these systems. They don't know how they work. Even most people graduating from like high school today, they don't use computers, they use phones. They don't know how the phone works. They know they go to the app store. They ask the app store for the app. They install the app. The app has, 3 tutorial swipes and that's it. The rest is magic. I think we need to help them understand not just how to use these apps, but how to control them. We need to make sure that when we're building systems, when we're building protocols, they are accessible. One of the things I worry about with crypto more broadly, whether you're talking about Bitcoin or Ethereum, is there is kind of a impulse toward embracing the arcane, where they have, all these improvement protocols or whatever, and they come up with all these new names and all these new terms, and they start writing like academic papers for like academic audiences, and they don't make it accessible. So then you're creating a new clergy, you're creating a new priesthood, you're creating a new special class, and what we don't want is to replicate the problems of the old, where we have specialist conversations among specialist institutions, and it's all lobbyists and stakeholders, and the average person cannot even be imagined to understand this unless they themselves become an expert. We want ordinary people to be able to see this, to understand how it works. Maybe the connections to like relays or how notes move or something like that. There's just a, cute little map or something like that, some animation, some, whether it's an infographic or something that just displays what's going on so people see it. I think, and this is one of the things when I look at my kids and I think about how I'm going to spend the next years of my life, we need more education in the world to explain to people just how the devices, how the systems, how the networks that surround us, that we depend on, how they function, how they can interact with them, how they can control them, how they can direct them without it being like, a dry programming tutorial or something. That kind of symbolic understanding is missing. It's a gap. We have those who know and we have those who don't. When you talk about, we've got this name Nostr, it's kind of like Gnostic and Gnosticism. You have people who have the revealed truth and those who don't. But that's not the ideal. If we want things to get better, we don't need to be creating a religion. We need to be creating a science. And it needs to be more like the age of the citizen scientist, in which we all have a hand. So with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone. Thank you, Jack, for the invitation. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate all of your support for everything in this community, for the Freedom of the Press Foundation, and for you personally, frankly, like I said, just for sticking around and trying to make things better as opposed to just relaxing, because it's been a pretty depressing time, I think, for a lot of people who are in this community who do understand the direction the internet is going, the direction geopolitics are going. They see this gravity occurring, and it feels inevitable to have someone like you on our side. I think it stiffens the spine, and it gives us hope. So I hope you'll be with us in this, and together I hope we can lead the way to really a better system and a better world. Thank you.
We will. We're on Nostr, we're really big on hugs. And while we can't give you a hug physically today, I know we will in the future. But in the meantime, I just wanted to ask everyone to take out the client of their choice, their device, and just send Snowden a hug through a post, through a note. And hopefully you can feel our admiration and our love and our gratefulness for you. And I hope to see you soon. We will.
I really appreciate it. It's wonderful.
Thank you, Edward.
And I will. I'll see you soon.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good
Thank you all.